Some people just don't know when to quit. Karen, she was one of them. And today, she had outdone herself. The grand entrance. A police car rolled up to my driveway, lights flashing dramatically against the early afternoon sun. Neighbors peeked out from behind their curtains, whispering excitedly. A few of them, the ones who had suffered under Karen's iron rule, even stepped outside, pretending to water their lawns just to get a front row seat. And right in the middle of it all, Karen. She stood with her arms crossed, wearing a smug expression, her clipboard tucked under one arm like a sword of justice. This was, in her mind, her moment of victory. Karen's triumphant speech. The second the officer stepped out of the car, Karen marched forward like a queen greeting her troops. "It's about time," she huffed, her voice dripping with self-importance. She pointed a perfectly manicured finger toward my backyard. "There's an unauthorized pool on this property," she declared. "And as per HOA regulations, no one can have a pool without my approval." The officer nodded, flipping through some papers. "Sir," he said, looking at me, "we have a warrant to seal the pool due to HOA violations." Karen smiled victoriously. Behind her, a few HOA board members nodded along, as if this was some great act of community justice. I sat there, reclining comfortably in my lounge chair by the pool, sipping a glass of lemonade, completely unbothered. Then, I did something that Karen did not expect. I laughed. Karen's confusion. Karen's smile faltered. She had expected anger, outrage, maybe even begging for mercy. But laughter? That wasn't part of the script. "What's so funny?" she snapped. I set my drink down, took off my sunglasses, and gave her a long, slow look. Then I leaned forward, clasped my hands together, and said very casually, "Karen, do you know who I am?" She scoffed. "You're just another HOA violator," she spat. "Someone who thinks they're above the rules." The officer shifted uncomfortably. Karen, oblivious, continued, "You might think you can get away with breaking the HOA guidelines, but not under my watch." I smirked. "Well, Karen," I said, grinning as I reached into my pocket and pulled out my own badge, "I hate to break it to you, but you just tried to flex your HOA power against the Attorney General of the United States." Karen's face drained of color. The officer froze mid-page flip, and the neighbors, they had just gotten the best entertainment of their lives. Because in that moment, Karen knew she had just made the biggest mistake of her career. There's a special kind of person who thrives on control, not because they actually have any real power, but because they think they do. And in this neighborhood, that person was Karen. A house outside HOA, and Karen's worst nightmare. I had just moved in a few months ago. A beautiful house, plenty of space, a backyard big enough to actually enjoy everything I could have asked for. And the best part, it wasn't part of the HOA, which meant no ridiculous fines, no Karen-approved color palettes, no weekly newsletters about community standards. It was perfect. Karen, however, Karen hated it, because in her mind, the entire neighborhood, HOA or not, should be under her jurisdiction. Karen's HOA rule book. The HOA had a lot of rules. Most of them were ridiculous. Trash cans must be brought in by 6:05 a.m. or else a $50 fine. Lawn must be trimmed exactly 2 inches high. Any shorter or longer, and you get a violation notice. Front doors must be painted in approved neutral tones. Translation, varying shades of beige. But the rule that Karen loved the most, the pool restriction. HOA regulations stated that pools over a certain size were not allowed to preserve neighborhood aesthetics, as Karen loved to phrase it. The problem? It didn't apply to me, because my house wasn't in the HOA, but Karen refused to accept that. Karen versus my pool. The moment she found out I was installing a pool, she showed up unannounced, clipboard in hand, fake smile plastered onto her face. "Hi there," she chirped, voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "I just wanted to check in about the community guidelines for pools." I had barely looked up from my conversation with the contractor. "Oh?" I said. "That's cute, but I'm not in the HOA." Karen's smile twitched. "Well, technically, the HOA does have influence over the entire neighborhood," she pressed, tightening her grip on her clipboard. I raised an eyebrow. "No, it doesn't." She huffed, straightening her posture like that somehow gave her more authority. "It's important for the visual harmony of the community that no one has a pool that's too large." I smirked. "And what's too large, Karen?" She hesitated, clearly making it up on the spot. "Well, anything over 15 feet wide is a violation of the..." Again, I cut in, grinning now. I'm not in the HOA, which means your rules don't apply to me. Karen stiffened, her fake smile finally breaking. Because deep down, she knew I was right. She had no authority here. But that didn't mean she was going to accept it. No, Karen didn't believe in losing. And that's when she made her next big mistake. She decided to go to war against me and my perfectly legal pool. Karen was not the type to take defeat gracefully. Some people, when faced with reality, will accept it and move on. Karen doubled down, because in her mind, losing was not an option. The warning letters begin. It started with the letters, hand-delivered, neatly typed, printed on official HOA stationery with a gold-trimmed logo as if that somehow gave them legal weight. Each one was more ridiculous than the last. Your pool does not meet HOA aesthetic requirements and must be removed immediately. The installation of a non-compliant pool violates community standards. Failure to comply may result in further action from the HOA enforcement team. I read them, then I ignored them. Because here's the thing, HOA rules don't apply to houses that aren't in the HOA. But Karen did not accept that reality. And when letters failed, she escalated. Karen sends in the inspectors. One morning, as I was enjoying a cup of coffee by my perfectly legal pool, I noticed something strange. A group of 3 people stood at the end of my driveway, clipboards in hand, snapping pictures of my house. One of them was even taking notes. I frowned. Then, setting down my coffee, I walked over. "Morning," I said casually. "Can I help you?" One of the men, wearing a cheap HOA-branded polo, glanced up. "We're with the HOA," he said. "This is a violation inspection." I blinked. Then, slowly, I smiled. "Ah," I said. "A violation inspection." He nodded seriously, as if that meant something. I stuffed my hands in my pockets, suppressing a laugh. "Interesting," I said. "Because, fun fact, I'm not in the HOA." The man hesitated. One of the others shifted uncomfortably. "Well," the first man stammered, "this area is under HOA jurisdiction." I cut him off with a chuckle. "No, it's not." The man's smile faltered. Karen, standing a few feet away, arms crossed smugly, jumped in. "Well, technically the HOA can still—" "Karen," I interrupted, turning to her, "unless you've suddenly gained government powers, you have no authority here." Her smug expression cracked slightly. She opened her mouth, probably ready to spew more nonsense. But I raised a hand. "You know what?" I said, grinning now. "I'll do you a favor." I pulled out my phone. "If you think you have a legal right to inspect my house, let's call the county zoning office and see what they think." Karen went stiff. The HOA inspectors suddenly looked very uncomfortable because we all knew they had no authority here. And now, they knew I knew it too. When Karen wants something, she doesn't take no for an answer. She doesn't take legal reality for an answer either. So when her HOA violation letters failed and her fake inspectors were laughed off my property, she did what any power-drunk suburban dictator would do. She called the police. Karen's emergency call, now. Imagine being the 911 dispatcher taking that call. Karen, in her most dramatic voice, reported a major violation happening in her community. A serious threat to the safety and harmony of the neighborhood. The crime? A swimming pool. "This is an environmental issue," she insisted to the dispatcher. "There's an illegal pool causing potential disruptions to our community's standards." The dispatcher, probably barely holding in a sigh, sent out an officer. And that's how 10 minutes later, a police car pulled up in front of my house, lights flashing. Karen's moment of glory. The second the police arrived, Karen was ready. She stood at the edge of my driveway, arms crossed, chest puffed out, clipboard tucked under her arm like a general preparing for battle. This, in her mind, was her moment of triumph. The moment where law enforcement would finally recognize her supreme authority. The moment she had been waiting for. One of the officers stepped out, adjusting his sunglasses, and casually walked up to me. "Afternoon, sir," he said. "We received a report about an illegal pool." I blinked. Then, slowly, I smiled. The "who reported it" game. "Oh," I said, raising an eyebrow. "And who reported it?" Before the officer could even respond, Karen stepped forward, tilting her head like a self-satisfied peacock. "I did," she announced. She glanced at me, then back at the officer, her smile practically glowing with smugness. "I'm the HOA president," she added, as if that somehow gave her the legal equivalent of a Supreme Court ruling. The officer gave her a polite nod. Then he turned back to me. "And this property?" he asked, flipping open his notepad. I grinned. "Oh," I said, "It's not in the HOA." Karen's smile faltered. The officer paused mid-note, then looked at her. Karen blinked. Her mouth opened slightly as if her brain was trying to reboot. "Well," she stammered, but this pool doesn't meet HOA aesthetic standards." The officer slowly raised an eyebrow, and that's when she realized she had just called the police over an aesthetic violation, and now she had to explain it. If Karen wanted to play games, I figured I'd play along. But unlike her, I actually knew the rules. Playing the part, I let out a dramatic sigh, as if I had finally come to my senses. Then, with a perfectly neutral expression, I gestured toward the officer's notepad. "All right," I was nodding seriously. "Let's see what we've got here." The officer handed over the warrant, which I pretended to scan carefully, tilting my head like I was deeply considering my next move. Karen, sensing an impending victory, grinned like a cat who just caught a mouse. Setting the trap, I took a deep breath, furrowing my brow, and turned to Karen. "So," I said slowly, tapping the paper, "this order is based on HOA regulations, correct?" Karen puffed up, her hands on her hips. "Of course," she said smugly. "We have very strict regulations to maintain community standards." I nodded thoughtfully. "Ah, I see." I turned to the officer, who was now watching closely. "So then," I continued, my tone deliberately casual, "OAs have rights to private property?" The officer stiffened slightly, his grip on his notepad tightening. Karen didn't notice. She was too busy basking in her imaginary victory. "Absolutely," she said, nodding enthusiastically. I raised an eyebrow as if intrigued by this revelation. "Oh, interesting," I said. "So the HOA can just override private property rights at any time without due process?" Karen nodded eagerly. "Exactly." Behind her, a few HOA board members shifted uncomfortably. The officer cleared his throat, suddenly looking a lot less comfortable. The knockout punch. I turned back to the officer, lowering my voice slightly, like I was about to share a little secret. "Officer," I said, offering a polite smile, "do you happen to know that under federal law, sealing private property without legal grounds can lead to—" "Oh, what's the word?" I paused, tapping my chin. "Oh, right. Litigation." Karen's smug expression vanished. The officer's eyes flicked back to Karen, his jaw tightened slightly. Because now he realized he had just been dragged into something very, very messy. And Karen had just talked herself into a disaster. The air was thick with tension. Karen stood rigid, arms crossed, her smug grin fading ever so slightly. The officer shifted, his grip tightening on his notepad, now realizing this situation was spiraling out of control. I took a slow breath, like I was carefully considering my next words. Then, deliberately, I reached into my pocket and pulled out a card. The moment everything changed. I held it up, letting the light catch the federal seal on the front. Then, with calm precision, I said, "I'm the Attorney General of the United States." A pause. Karen's mouth dropped open, her clipboard slipped slightly in her hands, as if even it couldn't believe what she had just heard. The officer? He froze mid-breath, his face instantly changing from casual professionalism to pure panic. Karen's eyes darted between me and the officer, her brain clearly trying to reboot. I leaned forward slightly, giving a polite but pointed smile. "And I think we have a little problem here." The death of Karen's confidence. Silence. Dead, painful, deafening silence. The same Karen who had been declaring HOA supremacy just moments ago? Now? She looked like she had just swallowed a brick. She blinked rapidly, her face draining of color, as if she had just realized she had been fighting a legal battle with the wrong person. The officer visibly gulped, as if calculating how quickly he could remove himself from this disaster. I let the moment stretch out, watching the slow collapse of Karen's entire world. Then, finally, I broke the silence. The final question. I tapped the edge of my ID card against my palm, then looked at the officer with polite curiosity. "So," I said, tilting my head, "do you want to double-check that you really want to seal this pool?" The officer snapped his notebook shut so fast it made a sound. Karen let out a strangled noise, somewhere between a gasp and a whimper. The officer cleared his throat, straightened his stance, then turned to Karen. "Ma'am," he said, his voice suddenly cold, "I think we need to discuss jurisdiction." Karen's knees visibly wobbled, because now she knew she was done. Karen had spent years barking orders, issuing fines, and convincing herself that she was the ultimate authority in this neighborhood. But now she looked like someone who had just walked off a cliff without realizing it. Her hands trembled slightly as she clutched her clipboard, as if it was some kind of lifeline. Her once arrogant stance had shrunk, shoulders tense, mouth slightly open, her brain scrambling for an escape route. And then she tried to fight back. Karen's pathetic attempt at defense. I don't know, she stammered, her voice suddenly far less confident than before. She let out a nervous chuckle, as if hoping this was all just some big misunderstanding. I was just following HOA rules. I arched an eyebrow. Then, as if I were genuinely considering her words, I nodded slowly. Oh, I said, dragging out the word. I see. Karen's eyes flickered with hope for about half a second. Then I tilted my head and added, smoothly, so what you're saying is the HOA has the power to override federal law? Karen's mouth snapped shut. The officer standing next to me, he cleared his throat loudly, a clear sign that he wanted absolutely nothing to do with this mess anymore. Then, slowly, he turned to Karen. Ma'am, he said, his tone suddenly much more serious, are you sure you want to continue with this? Karen's panic mode activates. Karen's jaw twitched. Sweat began forming at her temples, her clipboard suddenly feeling like dead weight in her hands. She opened her mouth, then closed it. Her gaze darted from me to the officer, then to the small group of neighbors who had gathered to watch the show unfold. Some of them, they looked downright amused. Because they had seen this before. They had seen Karen steamroll over everyone for years. But today, she had finally met someone she couldn't bulldoze. The moment she realized she lost, Karen let out a weak, forced chuckle, wiping her sweaty palms on her skirt. This is all just a misunderstanding, she muttered. I was only trying to. I held up a hand. Karen, I said, calm and even, if you say one more word, I might actually have to file a federal complaint against you. Karen froze. The officer took a small step away from her, as if he didn't want to be caught in the blast radius of what was about to happen. And Karen? Karen finally understood. She had lost, and there was no way out. Karen's confidence was officially dead. Her smugness, gone. Her sense of control, shattered. And yet, despite every warning, despite the officer practically begging her to back down, she still hadn't fully grasped the severity of her mistake. But she was about to, because now I was done playing games. The call that changed everything. I pulled out my phone, scrolling through my contacts. Karen's eyes locked onto it instantly. What are you doing? She stammered, voice tight with barely contained panic. I didn't answer. Instead, I hit call. The phone rang twice before a voice picked up. Department of Justice, how may I direct your call? Karen visibly flinched. I smiled politely, speaking in the most calm, professional tone possible. This is the Attorney General, I said, glancing at Karen as I spoke. I have a private property violation that I'd like to escalate for investigation. Karen's breakdown begins. Karen let out a choked noise, somewhere between a gasp and a strangled sob. Her clipboard slipped from her fingers, hitting the pavement with a dull thud. The officer standing beside her, he subtly took another step back, clearly not wanting to be associated with whatever legal nightmare Karen had just triggered. Meanwhile, my voice remained steady. Yes, I continued, as if Karen wasn't currently having an existential crisis beside me. It appears a local HOA is attempting to illegally seize control of private property under the false pretense of community regulations. Karen's breathing grew uneven. She turned to the officer, desperation creeping into her expression. Stop him, she hissed. The officer did not move. Instead, he simply folded his arms and watched, because at this point, even he knew Karen had dug her own grave. The neighborhood watches Karen fall by now. A small crowd of HOA residents had gathered, watching the scene unfold. They had witnessed Karen's reign of terror for years. But this was something new. Whispers spread through the crowd. Did she really just mess with the Attorney General? Oh, she's done. I bet she thought she could just bully her way out of this one, too. Karen heard every word. Her face burned red, sweat beading along her forehead as she realized she wasn't just losing power. She was losing her reputation, and in an HOA, that was worse than death. The moment of absolute defeat, Karen lunged forward, hands trembling. We don't need to get the federal government involved, she stuttered. This is just a small misunderstanding. We can fix this internally. I held up a hand, cutting her off mid-sentence. Karen, I said, my voice calm, firm, and final, you crossed a legal boundary you had no business crossing. Karen staggered back, her breath shaky, her hands clutching at nothing, because in that moment, she finally understood she was destroyed, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Karen had spent years building her little HOA empire. She had bullied homeowners, issued ridiculous fines, controlled everything from mailbox colors to the number of lawn decorations allowed. But now her entire world was crumbling, because when the federal government gets involved, everything changes. The investigation begins. The investigation was launched immediately. HOA records were subpoenaed. Financial transactions were reviewed. Every questionable fine Karen had issued was now under a microscope, and it didn't take long for the real dirt to come out. Turns out, Karen had been abusing her position for years. She had fined people for unauthorized garden gnomes, threatened to tow cars legally parked in driveways, used HOA funds for her personal benefit. And now, the HOA was facing a potential $100,000 fine for gross abuse of power. The residents revolt. Word spread fast. The HOA board called an emergency meeting, hoping to control the fallout. But by the time they gathered in the clubhouse, the entire neighborhood had shown up, and they weren't happy. Karen sat at the front of the room, still clinging to the last shreds of her authority, clipboard resting in her lap like a security blanket. But when the meeting began, she never even had a chance. A resident stood up. "I want to know," he said, voice steady, "why my HOA fees are about to go up because Karen couldn't control herself." Murmurs of agreement filled the room. Another neighbor raised a hand. "She tried to fine me $200 because my garden hose was too visible. She told me I couldn't have a wreath on my door because it wasn't HOA approved. She once told my wife that her flowers were an eyesore and demanded we replant them." Karen visibly tensed, her face paling as she realized she had lost the people. Karen is officially removed. The HOA board, now fully aware that Karen was a liability, acted fast. A member stood up. "It's clear," she said, clearing her throat, "that leadership changes are necessary." A second member nodded. "I move for an immediate vote to remove Karen as HOA president." Karen's head snapped up. "Wait," she stammered, "I've always done what's best for the community." "You called the police on the attorney general." The room went silent. Karen gulped, and then the vote was unanimous. Karen was officially dismissed. She had no power, no authority, no clipboard, nothing. And the best part, the HOA itself was forced to overhaul its entire system. No more insane rules, no more pointless fines, and most importantly, no more Karen. Karen had spent years believing she was unstoppable, that she could control everything, that the HOA was her personal kingdom, that the rules didn't apply to her, only to everyone else. But in the end, she lost. And just like that, the reign of Queen Karen came to an end. Karen's final exit. A few weeks after the vote, a moving truck pulled up in front of Karen's house. No big farewell speech, no last-minute power grabs, no dramatic goodbyes. Just a for sale sign in the yard and a woman packing up her clipboard for the last time. Neighbors peeked out from their windows, watching the fall of an empire with barely concealed amusement. Nobody offered to help. Nobody waved goodbye. By the end of the day, Karen was gone. A celebration in the best way possible. With Karen officially out of the picture, the neighborhood did what any sane group of people would do. They threw a pool party right in the very pool Karen tried to destroy. People showed up in droves, bringing drinks, food, and even a giant inflatable flamingo. Music blasted. Kids splashed around. Someone even set up a floating cooler full of beer. It was the HOA's worst nightmare, which made it perfect. A simple conversation. As I stood by the grill, flipping burgers, a neighbor walked up and clapped me on the back. "You know," he said, shaking his head, "you literally took down the HOA in a day." I chuckled, taking a sip of my drink. "Nah," I said, grinning. "I just wanted to swim in peace." And with that, I leaned back in my chair, letting the warm sun hit my face, finally in a Karen-free neighborhood. Karen was gone. The HOA, effectively powerless. And me, I was exactly where I wanted to be, lounging by my pool, completely unbothered. The aftermath. In the weeks after Karen's spectacular downfall, the HOA was placed under strict oversight. No more ridiculous fines, no more power-hungry board members acting like suburban dictators, no more unnecessary violations based on Karen's personal preferences. The new HOA leadership, they knew better than to mess with me. And my pool? Still here, still perfectly legal, still the best thing in the neighborhood. A simple question. One lazy afternoon, as I was sipping a cocktail by the pool, a kid from the neighborhood ran up to me. He stopped at the edge of the water, looking up at me with wide, curious eyes. "Hey," he said, tilting his head. "Are you the guy who took down the HOA?" I chuckled, taking a slow sip of my drink. Then, after a pause, I shrugged. "Nah," I said, flashing a grin. "I'm just a law-abiding citizen. A Karen-free paradise." With that, the kid nodded approvingly and ran off. And me, I leaned back in my chair, letting the sun warm my face as I listened to the peaceful sounds of my neighborhood. No Karen. No HOA drama. No clipboard-wielding maniacs trying to take my pool away. Just me, my perfectly legal pool, and a life free from HOA nonsense. Justice had been served. And damn, did it feel good.